And just welcome everyone to the next webinar in the Freshwater Stewardship Community Series. We're really excited that all of you have chosen to spend your Saturday mornings with us to hear the amazing results that Chris has been able to compile for the Planning for Our Shorelands project. And I'm not going to talk too much about it because Chris is the expert on it and he's done a lot of hard work and I think connected with many of you who have tuned in. So we're really grateful for the responses that you've given us during this project and just excited to share the results. Before we get going with Chris's presentation though, I am just going to do kind of a bit of a background about the community and also Watersheds Canada. So like I said, we've been hosting, some of you have been joining us for each of our monthly webinars, which has been really lovely as well. This is the fourth one in our community series, and we've just launched this community at the beginning of 2021, kind of a response to everything that's going on in the world and just being able to still connect with all of you and provide you with different opportunities to connect with other groups, but also just share our work and share the amazing work our partners are doing. So I'll just get going with introductions. So Chris and I will do a bit of introductions. Then Chris will have his presentation. We'll also have time for a Q&A at the end. I know some of you did submit questions when you registered, and I have passed those on to Chris, so he will also be answering those before we open up to the floor. And then at the end, we'll just have a bit of housekeeping and talk about the next webinar, which is just in a few weeks. So the two people that are kind of going to be with you this morning are Chris and myself. So I'm the Communications and Fundraising Coordinator at Watersheds Canada. If you're having any technical issues today, you can private message me through Zoom. If you want to contact us, both of our emails are up on the screen. And like I said, Chris is our municipal policy intern, and he's going to be presenting about the Planning for Our Shorelands project. So just an introduction to Watersheds Canada, in case you are not familiar with us. We are a national nonprofit and charitable organization based in Perth, Ontario. And we really focus on helping shoreline property owners, community groups, and grassroots organizations enhance and protect their freshwater areas, so their lakes, rivers, and shorelands. And we're able to do this through a lot of amazing partnerships with local community groups. Some of you are here from different lake associations, and you help us deliver these really important on-the-ground projects to give people tools and resources they need to protect their freshwater. So the first one I have up on the screen here is our Love Your Lake program. And this is a shoreline stewardship project. So pre-COVID, we would all go out in a boat together and we would have trained individuals in communities across Canada who would use the protocol pictured on the right. And we're really providing each property on a lake or river with kind of conditions that they're facing. So if there are erosion, is there wildlife habitat available? Maybe there's presence of invasive species. We're able to document this all in this protocol and then provide these shoreland owners with an individualized property report. And then they get this property report specific to their property, and they're able to take voluntary actions to improve their habitat availability and the water quality. And this program is developed and delivered in partnership with the Canadian Wildlife Federation and then local grassroots organizations. Another program that we're able to offer are fish habitat enhancement projects. So there's two different ones pictured on the slide here. The top left is the brush bundles, or the in-water fish habitat enhancement. And the woody debris that we're able to put back into these water bodies is really important for fish, turtles, and invertebrates. Provides them with shelter and feeding areas as well as spawning areas. So we work with different community groups who have identified that they're lacking the woody debris that they may normally have had. Maybe it's been removed. And we're able to restore this habitat through these woody debris. And then in the bottom right, we have a picture of a walleye spawning bed that we were able to restore. So again, working with these community groups, identifying areas where there has been historic walleye population and maybe where the spawning beds have been degraded, and we're able to restore it. We also do cold water creek enhancements, so we're planting large trees along the shoreland to be able to provide shade that is needed for cold water spawning. And then some of you may be familiar with our Natural Edge program. So this is our shoreline restoration program where we're working with community groups, shoreline property owners, and agricultural property owners to restore really any area beside a lake or river or even a tributary. And this is to do a couple of really important things. The first being stabilizing that shoreline with the different root systems of the native plants. We're also focusing on filtering out excess nutrients so they're not going into the water. And of course, providing important wildlife habitat as well as for our pollinators. So if you are interested in learning more about the Natural Edge program, the website is thenaturaledge.watersheds.ca. And there's also a lot of free resources on that website, as well as a native plant database, which is Canada-wide based on Canada's hardiness zones. And many of you asked about this in your registration form. So you're able to go through your ecozone and also your province and different filters like sunlight availability, moisture level in the soil, and just filter out what you would like for your property. There's pictures of everything. You can see how tall they grow. And so it's a really great free resource for any of you who might be thinking about naturalizing your shoreline with some native plants. As well, I mentioned we have a lot of free resources on our website. Many of these have been co-created with amazing organizations. So the first one you can see up there was with the Lake Links Planning Committee. They were able to create a lake protection workbook, which you can access for free online or order a hard copy. And all of these resources are really created with communities in mind and the needs they have to take local action to protect their shorelands. So we're able to create different handouts. Chris is going to be talking about a report that we're going to be able to publish soon from his project. And you can find all of these at watersheds.ca/resources. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, our freshwater stewardship community was launched just 2 months ago, and we're looking to try and connect everyone. We're so used to being able to see you in person, coming to different events and AGMs, and we didn't want to lose that right now because of COVID. So we're trying to put everything online and just provide these same connections and resources that we would have been able to do otherwise. We've been hosting monthly webinars, and we're also really excited to be launching a number of education initiatives this summer, specifically for children and youth. So many of you will be hearing about that as you've identified on the registration form that you're an informal or formal educator or a parent or grandparent, and we're hoping to provide you with these tools to get your family outside in a safe way and just learn more about the native species that are in your area and how you can help protect them. And we do want to acknowledge that funding for this community was provided by the SM Blair Family Foundation. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen so that Chris can go ahead, and I'm just going to give you a bit of background about Chris. So Chris was born in the heart of the Thousand Islands, and he has a long professional and personal relationship with freshwater stewardship. His academic background in the social and natural sciences has afforded him the skills necessary to find innovative and meaningful solutions to conservation issues. He has thoroughly enjoyed his time collaborating with so many people during his tenure as the municipal policy intern with Watersheds Canada, as well as his independent work developing. Sorry, Chris's presentation took over my screen. As well as his independent work developing planning for our shorelands. Outside of his academic and professional endeavors, he is an avid outdoorsman and writer, and he will soon begin pursuing a Master of Science at Trent University. So I'm going to pass it off to Chris.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Monica, and welcome everyone, and thank you so much for attending the next in our Freshwater Stewardship Community Series. It's been wonderful to have such a diversity of topics being discussed during these webinars, and I hope I'm able to continue the momentum provided by Natasha from Birds Canada and Juno from Water Rangers. So today's webinar will focus on the topic of shoreland stewardship from two pretty fundamental perspectives, one societal and the other scientific. Specifically, I'll be providing a brief introduction to the exciting and sometimes troubled science behind and policy behind shoreland management in our province. We will then discuss a sample of results from my recent report on 3 surveys, which were directed at municipal planners, elected municipal officials, and lake and river associations. These surveys were developed in order to gauge the current state of shoreland policy and land use in Ontario according to the aforementioned stakeholders. The results of these surveys will inform the next stages of our project, which is planning for our shorelands, a project that's going to seek to provide succinct, easily accessible, and scientifically informed best management resources and shoreland networking opportunities to those working on this critical environmental issue, with the intention of strengthening the conservation of lakes and rivers, which provide countless societal and ecological benefits to our local communities. So I know Monica's already given a personal introduction, but before moving forward, I'll just reiterate with a brief personal introduction myself. So again, my name's Christopher Dennison. You can just call me Chris, and I'm currently working as a municipal policy intern with Watersheds Canada. Again, I hold 2 separate degrees, one in political science from Trent University and another in biology from Trent. And I hail from Gananoque, a small town nestled on the shores of Thousand Islands National Park. And I'll begin pursuing my Master of Science this spring, where I'll be working on amphibian conservation genetics, specifically related to the threatened western chorus frog. So as part of my position with Watersheds Canada, I have facilitated the project planning for our shorelands. However, it's really important to stress that this project is not mine alone. I think my work would not be possible without the support of my steering committee and the generous donations made by the Daniel and Susan Gottlieb Foundation, the Lush Charity Pot, the Impact Internship Program, and the White Lake Preservation Program. Needless to say, planning for our shorelands is a collaborative effort, and I believe this is what provides the project with its foundational strength. So to begin this webinar, it's going to be important for us to define a particular term which will be used a lot today, and that's the term shoreland. Now, many are probably accustomed to the term shoreline when talking about the land surrounding freshwater lakes and rivers. Growing up on the shores of the St. Lawrence, I know I always refer to these lands as being on the shoreline. However, when discussing broad topics such as shore ecology, environmental science, and issues of development and land use, shorelands is a much more appropriate and encompassing term since it includes each of the 4 major ecozones just below and above the surface of the lake or river. The Shore Primer by Fisheries and Oceans provides an excellent illustration by David Wasotsky showing each of these ecozones in relation to the water's edge. There is the upland zone, which is a well-drained highland area above the riparian zone, which when well vegetated features mature coniferous and deciduous trees and shrubs. The riparian is an ecozone many are likely familiar with, so it's the land that's just above the shoreline itself, often in the form of a wetland or semi-aquatic land. It's here that we are able to see such great levels of biodiversity of plants and animals. In the illustration on the right, we see some familiar faces. We see some eastern bluebirds flying around, red-winged blackbirds, some waterfowl, and many reeds, shrubs, aquatic plants, and rushes, all of which are associated with the riparian zone. So below the riparian is the shoreline itself, being the strip of space where the water meets the land. Here we can find many nesting birds like our common loons, and other important amphibians, macroinverts, and insects. And finally, moving on down, there's the littoral zone, which dives beneath the surface and lasts to the point in the water where sunlight no longer reaches the bottom of the water body. And this is where we find many of our familiar fish species, largemouth bass, pike, perch, pumpkin seed, shiners, you name it. It's critical that we take each of these 4 zones into consideration when making land use decisions, as each has its own specific role to play biologically, and each provides different ecosystem services to the people that live on them. Additionally, developments close to the water impact each of the 4 zones in very different ways. So with this better understanding of what a shoreland is, we can transition into a deeper discussion of the importance these shorelands play. starting with their diverse biological roles. So among their many biological roles, the upland, riparian, and shoreline zones of shorelands work in unison to form what we might consider nature's filtration system. Runoff from developments, road salting, and domestic fertilization are all diverted from the water body through soil-mediated attenuation and through uptake by the roots of woody and herbaceous plants. Of course, this is only the case when native vegetation is left to grow, from the black willows down to the pickerel weeds. Each of the 4 ecozones we're discussing provide essential habitat for a variety of animals, reptiles like snapping turtles and water snakes, shorebirds like the osprey, fish like the northern pike, and countless insect species like this 12-spotted skimmer dragonfly. Of course, many of these species also become prey for predators, while others rely on aquatic shoreland vegetation for their own food. One other interesting biological role of shorelands is temperature regulation. Ectotherms, like our reptiles and fishes, depend on temperature regimes in their habitat for their physiological well-being. And this can include the provision of shade for littoral species like the brook trout, and shade that only comes from well-vegetated riparian zones. And this can also include basking structures for species like turtles and snakes. I'm sure many have seen these reptiles lounging on a submerged log or an exposed stone. Now, these ecological features may seem undesirable to some, but to a snapper, it's a deluxe lawn chair. Speaking of lawn chairs, we can now transition into some of the societal benefits shorelands provide. Interestingly, many of the societal benefits listed on this slide are much the same as the biological benefits we have just discussed. Indeed, shorelands give many opportunities for human habitat, whether through family cottages or four-season dwellings. Shorelands also provide food to those who take advantage of the excellent angling opportunities our freshwater lakes and rivers afford. I personally consider biodiversity to be of a major societal and cultural importance. I have to say, nothing much compares to observing and interacting with wildlife, such as the feeling of holding a blue-spotted salamander for the first time. These experiences can change the way individuals view the lands and waters around them, and even their worldview, having major influence on the values and attitudes these people carry with them, something important for us to consider later on in this webinar. In addition, shorelands provide us countless levels of recreational enjoyment, whether it be hiking, paddling, angling, or swimming. To many, shorelands are also an important source of employment and income, especially for builders, contractors, planners, and ecotourism firms. Ultimately, these societal benefits all fall under the umbrella of ecosystem services, being any positive benefit ecosystems and accompanying wildlife provide to society. The ecosystem services listed here are just a small sample. Indeed, these services are as broad and diverse as the people and wildlife who inhabit shoreland environments. So now that we've discussed the broad importance of shorelands from both a societal and a biological perspective, we now must discuss some of the issues surrounding the protection of said ecosystems. Unfortunately, there are a myriad of factors currently impacting shoreland conservation in Ontario. Given the countless opportunities shorelands provide, it's no wonder there is a current, seemingly exponential demand for shoreland property and development by those who want to experience life on a lake or river. Growing up in Thousand Islands National Park, I can wholeheartedly say that I would not be the person I am today had my parents not raised me on the shores of the St. Lawrence. But is this exodus from urban landscapes to rural shorelands occurring at too fast a pace, driven perhaps even by the coronavirus pandemic that we're all living through right now? The graph on the bottom left of this slide shows average days on the market for a sample of waterfront properties being sold in Ontario's cottage country. And we can see that in 2020, that average dropped significantly below a 10-year average, suggesting a considerable demand for these properties. This exponential growth in sales of waterfront homes, cottages, and properties is also shown in the graph in the top right of the slide, which show waterfront sale trends since January of 2017. Obviously, we can see trends leading through the year 2020 exceeded those of previous years. On top of these short-term waterfront sales trends, Ontario's cottage country, where many important shoreland ecosystems reside, is slated to experience higher than normal patterns of long-term population growth in the coming decades, as shown in the map on the bottom right corner of the slide. Now, all this is to say that there is an observable demand for shoreland properties and accompanying lifestyles, which in and of itself may not appear troublesome. However, with demand comes inevitable growing pains, oftentimes in the form of unsustainable developments. Now, it's important to emphasize that not all development is unsustainable. As shown in the two illustrations on the right, there is often a good or sustainable way to develop and a rather poor or unsustainable way. Lawns down to the water's edge, the removal of native vegetation, hardening of the shoreland, and a disregard for appropriate setbacks are all classic issues associated with which we might consider unsustainable shoreland building and land use practices. The golden rule is that the more one disturbs a shoreland from the way they first found it in its natural or semi-natural state, the more unsustainable the development tends to become. And one of the outstanding concerns of shoreland stakeholders and stewards is reduced water quality resulting from runoff. With the removal of vegetation and accompanying unsustainable building practices, there is a net reduction in the capacity of the shoreland to mitigate the loading of contaminants and nutrients, which can lead to eutrophication, the growth of harmful algal blooms, and cyanobacteria, which are pictured here on the left at the microscopic level. Now, programs such as the Natural Edge seek to remedy these disturbances through shoreland planting and awareness initiatives, but a lot of work is still required on countless lakes and rivers where shoreline development continues unabated and often in an unsustainable manner. And for anyone wanting a more in-depth analysis of the impacts of shoreland clustering and developments on lakes and rivers, I would highly recommend Kathleen Egan's 2014 dissertation on shoreland modification and its impacts on lake ecology, which provides a regionally relevant analysis of this issue. And this resource is available through the University of Toronto. So we have seen that an increased demand for shoreland properties results in a subsequent demand for developments, which in many cases occur in an unsustainable manner. This development, whether through the removal of native vegetation, additional poor landscaping choices, and physical alterations to the shoreland, have immediate implications for water quality and the incidence of unwanted algal blooms. But beyond this, we must also consider what development pressure does to the shoreland more broadly, including its impact on shoreland ecology. There are several studies pertaining to the issue of shoreland development and its impacts on biodiversity. Some have analyzed the negative impacts of development on the behavior of mustelids, like the American mink, one of my favorite shoreland animals. The researchers found that simplification of the littoral zone and alteration of the upland and riparian zones were associated with decreased mink activity. A reduction in certain prey animals also impacted the diet of these apex shoreland predators, implying important ramifications for shoreland food webs. Another paper examined the impact development had on amphibian abundance, specifically green frogs. Now, not surprisingly, green frog abundance was found to be negatively correlated with increased development and was greatly reduced by reduction in suitable habitat. Now, these reductions often occur as a consequence of increased building practices, and these findings can be intuitively applied across amphibian species and likely more broadly. Increased human development and habitation has also found to have impact on the behavior and well-being of many water birds, hooded mergansers and wood ducks and nesting loons. And of course, manipulating the soil and natural diversity of shoreland plant communities has lingering effects on the ability of these environments to provide the ecosystem services we mentioned previously. So the information in these last three slides have contained only a microscopic sample of issues related to shoreland development, demand, and ecology. Regardless of which particular issues are most important on a given lake or river, they will only continue to grow as the demand for shoreland living and development continues. With this in mind, we must ask ourselves, what is to be done about these problems? Shoreland ecology and land use are highly complex issues, bringing together a diversity of viewpoints and stakeholder groups. It involves science, policy, the attitudes and values of human beings, and the needs of so many species of wild plants and animals. With such a dense web of values and needs, collaboration will certainly provide the foundation for meaningful progress on this issue. That is where the Planning for Our Shorelands project and its recent survey campaign come in, and they both start at the grassroots. When we began the Planning for Our Shorelands project, we wanted to ensure that we were taking the needs and concerns of those who would be using our resource into account. As such, we developed 3 stakeholder surveys for planners, municipal councillors, and lake and river associations to determine what were currently the greatest barriers to shoreland stewardship and sustainable land use across Ontario's many regions and municipalities. Using the results of these surveys, we would be well situated to make the resources and networks provided through Planning for Our Shorelands as useful and meaningful as possible. Now, I have to say, I was quite impressed with the level of engagement these surveys produced. We received a total of 189 responses from across our 3 stakeholder groups, with 123 representatives from over 50 lake and river associations, 23 planners working for conservation authorities and municipalities, and 44 elected municipal officials, which included mayors, members of council, and reeves. Now, our respondents represented a rather diverse portion of Ontario, with most residing in the areas around Haliburton and Muskoka, as well as Frontenac County. We had many from the Golden Horseshoe region and around the Great Lakes, as well as northern representation from Manitoulin Island, Temagami Township, and even Lake of the Woods. It was very reassuring for me to see such passion for shoreland stewardship across the province. And in the future, we hope to gain greater involvement from northern regions and Indigenous communities. So what did our respondents have to say about the barriers to achieving shoreland stewardship goals on their lake or river? Of the barriers to shoreland stewardship cited by our respondents, the most predominant and observed barrier cited was a poor level of education and subsequent attitudes and understanding about shoreland ecosystem preservation on the part of some waterfront property owners, policymakers, and developers. This barrier was most noted by lake and river associations, but was also well recognized by planners and municipal officials. Now, it seems that this barrier stems from a perceived dichotomy between environmental concern and economic need, without many realizing that there's a possibility for a more balanced approach. Moving on, lake and river associations noted an average to below average level of engagement in stewardship initiatives from waterfront residents in their region. And 43% of planners believe that the natural heritage objectives in their municipality's official plan were at odds with shoreland property owners and those who developed shorelands. In addition to unsustainable attitudes, values, and practices, our respondents also noted other barriers to shoreland stewardship. Perhaps not surprisingly, municipal officials had cited a lack of support from the provincial level and a downloading of responsibility as a considerable barrier. Planners echoed the concern of a lack of resources, but also mentioned the lack of long-term monitoring on shoreland properties to ensure site plan control measures were effective and that best practices were being followed and enforced. Now, I have to stress that this is just a small sample of barriers reported during our surveys. However, the most significant of these certainly related to education and a fundamental lack of understanding about shoreland conservation on the part of many local and regional actors. So in addition to the most significant barriers to facilitating shoreland stewardship, we also wanted to gauge what respondents considered the most important shoreland issues impacting their lake or river. Now, this question garnered a diversity of responses, but with some observable consistencies. Invasive species, pollution, water quality, and general ecosystem health consistently ranked high across the 3 stakeholder groups. It is also important to note that 57% of Lake and River Association respondents noted that their lake or river environment was already at or approaching biological capacity, with an additional 32% noting that their shorelands were getting busier in recent years due to development. As such, the growth and demand for shoreland development discussed earlier seems to be of major concern. This growth and development has the capacity to exacerbate fundamental environmental problems, including invasive species introductions, reduction in water quality, and the alteration of wildlife habitat. Some other interesting issues that were mentioned related to light and noise pollution, seasonal flooding, and boat traffic. So from our surveys, it was clear that our respondents considered a lack of education, unsustainable attitudes, and subsequently poor land use practices as consistent and major barriers to improving shoreline stewardship on their lakes and rivers. In addition, many pressing issues resulting from ineffective stewardship practices were identified, including ecosystem health, invasive species, and of course, water quality. Again, this is a small sample of results from our surveys, but even this small sample is quite illuminating and begs the question, what can and should be done to mitigate these problems? So our surveys tried to tap into this question by gauging whether existing shoreland best practices were being utilized for shoreland protection. Specifically, we asked respondents to rate best management resources in terms of their importance to solving complex shoreland issues. Planners and municipal officials were quite adamant that best practice resources were important or very important to their work as it related to shoreland conservation and land use. Some of the most important qualities of utilized resources were ease of procurement, simplicity, format, and the scientific legitimacy of the information they contained. Lake and river associations also noted current or previous use of many best practice resources, including the Dock Primer, FOCA's Guide to Healthy Waterfronts, and others provided by regional conservation authorities. In addition to the use of simple, scientifically informed best practice resources, respondents across each stakeholder group also seemed quite receptive to the prospect of participating in a larger shoreland network and forum where stakeholders could share ideas, successes, resources, and experiences. Given these results, the provision of easily accessible, understandable, and scientifically informed best practice resources and enhanced networking opportunities may offer short and long-term solutions to the lingering problem of poor understanding and unsustainable attitudes and practices on the part of many shoreland stakeholders. So this leads us to some broad conclusions from the survey report that are provided here. The first broad conclusion relates to the need for shoreland networking and collaboration. Access to open and meaningful consultations and discussions related to shoreland issues and positive case studies need to be available to all involved stakeholders. And this is especially true in regions where access to shoreland resources or communications are limited, such as in regions where there is no conservation authority present. Our second broad conclusion involves improving shoreland education measures for property owners, contractors, and other involved stakeholders. This could take the form of public lectures or accredited seminars on particular topics of interest, and of course, the dissemination of informed resources over a variety of formats. And this segues nicely into our last general conclusion, which is that there is a need for interactive, organic, accessible, and creative best practice resources which synthesize complex scientific findings and policy recommendations. We need to make it simpler for shoreland stakeholders to understand and implement solutions. And this involves providing information which is available and interpretable to everyone involved in the process. And that brings us to really the end of the meat of our seminar. I want to leave a lot of time for us to go over some questions, but I'm very excited by the progress being made on planning for our shorelands, and with the help of lake and river stewards like yourselves, I am sure we can make it a collaborative effort to conserve our shoreland ecosystems through the provision of informed resources and networks for a diversity of stakeholders. Again, I'd like to thank all of our generous contributors and donators, the Daniels and Susan Gottlieb Foundation, the White Lake Preservation Project, the Lush Charity Pot, the Impact Internship Project, my tireless steering committee members, and all the great folks at Watersheds Canada, and of course, all of you for attending. So again, thank you so much, and we can begin the Q&A session of our webinar. And like Monica had said, we received quite a few preliminary questions from registrants prior to today's webinar. And I'll begin by addressing these as best as I can, And following this, Monica and I can answer some questions from the live chat box. First, I'm going to rehydrate. So we can start with some of the questions that we received prior to the webinar itself. So one of the first questions was, what are 3 things every cottager can do to protect their shoreland? This is obviously a fundamental question and one which needs answering. In my personal opinion, working with this issue, 3 of the major things that cottagers can do to protect their shorelands is 1, plant native species of vegetation on your shoreland. And this can be done using the Natural Edge database, which is a great tool for picking appropriate plants and reeds, shrubs, things like that, based on your hardiness zone and where your lake or river is located. Another thing that cottagers can do, which might seem a bit, open to interpretation, but to me at least it's important, is to do less and not more. I think nature's extremely well suited to finding an equilibrium, and oftentimes our ability to manage it is pales in comparison to nature's ability to find an equilibrium between nature and society. And one of the last things that cottagers can do, I think, which is really important, is to get involved with their local lake or river association or environmental groups. It's fun and it's useful to volunteer with these groups, and it allows for a greater dissemination of information and experiences. Again, collaboration is hugely important for this issue. So another question related to the impact of existing footprints and development within these footprints. And that's the assumed right to tear down and rebuild grandparent structures. So yeah, we're talking about legal non-complying structures, and they certainly are an issue, and a sensitive one at that. The issue has been revisited in some municipalities. I know in South Frontenac there was an amendment that was attempted that, without getting into too much detail, had received quite a bit of negativity from the community, unfortunately. I think if there's a discussion, public consultation, and that's all important. And I think it's also quite circumstantial when dealing with these issues of land use and planning. Sometimes moving a structure, whether it's a septic or system or an entire cottage, can be quite difficult. And in my opinion, net environmental gain is an approach that I like quite a bit. So if your non-complying structure is being built in the same footprint or outside of it, perhaps there can be a stipulation in site plan control that a certain amount of native vegetation can be planted. So site plan control like this does occur, and again, it's highly dependent on where it occurs, and this necessitates consultation with all stakeholders. So one of the next questions is, please comment on the 30-meter versus 10-meter shoreline preservation discussion. To be quite blunt, to me at least, might be biased due to being an ecologist and on the environmental front of things, but 10 meters just isn't enough. There's this misconception that if a setback is even 30 meters, then it's a-okay. It still needs to be vegetated to be effective. And there might be a setback that's 30 meters, but it might all be lawn. That pales in comparison to something that's well vegetated with native vegetation, trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants. So in my opinion, a 10-meter setback, even with effective vegetation, would not necessarily suffice in attenuating nutrient contaminants and things like that making its way into the lake or river. And I can also share a scientific report which does a literature review on the importance of certain size buffers and their ability to mitigate some of the contaminants that make their way into the water body. So just a few more questions here. So very exciting progress. Thank you very much. Is there an initial component of the plan to help municipalities not only initially focus on educational campaign, but continue the educational outreach? So absolutely. Collaboration will be huge, and we want to make this resource organic. So what I mean by organic is we want the resources that are provided through Planning for Our Shorelands, including the resource website and the networking component, to evolve along with our municipalities, with our developers, and with our lake and river associations. In our surveys, the issue of not enough monitoring and implementation was cited quite consistently. which could be interpreted as a lack of following up after best practices are provided. And we hope through continued organic consultation and education measures, we will mitigate this issue on the education front. And this is a good question. How can we convince cottage owners to leave their shorelands natural? And yes, I have to concede that it is quite hard to make some folks care as much as we would like. And it's sometimes hard to convey an ecological message without coming off as a pest. I think, or would like to think, that most folks care at least to some degree about things like water quality and wildlife. If we can make it clear that there can be a balance between shoreland aesthetics and ecological preservation, I think we can make huge strides. Again, I need to stress the aspect of balance being a huge component of making this work. Another question was, are there any organizations that can assist landowners with planning to avoid land erosion along the Great Lakes? And my answer to that is, where they're present, conservation authorities are a great resource in this regard. Local lake and river associations and environmental organizations are also great resources. In the digital age, all it takes is a quick Google search to find amazing organizations which are dedicated to this issue. And just 3 more before we go into the chat box portion. So this question was hoping you can touch on balancing design and rehabilitation for human use in nature. So I think just making folks aware that this balance is even possible is a huge step forward. I think we need to see a shift in how landscaping is done. And on a personal note, my wife is a landscape designer and she focuses on ecologically sound landscape designs. And I think through this project, we need to give ecologically minded landscapers the stage to show off their work that allows for this balance between enjoyment, aesthetics, and wildlife. Again, it's all about discussions, consultations, and sharing our experiences to come to this equilibrium. Much like nature itself, I suppose, nature does tend to be a pretty good teacher. Another question, should municipalities allow minor variance applications which allow construction within 30 meters of the high water mark? Which government agency has authority to enforce protection? Should they? This will obviously depend on who you're asking, but from an ecological perspective, no, they should not. But as far as I'm aware, municipalities are ultimately responsible for enforcing bylaws which they are putting in place. It's unfortunate when some minor variances do occur and there's nothing one can do since it's approved. But ultimately, from my perspective, with educative measures, we can eventually lead to a more receptiveness to policy changes which achieve a balance between what humans want and what our shorelands need. And the final question which I got was, can municipalities order the removal of harmful shoreland structures like cement breakwaters? If not, are there remediation procedures to mitigate their damage? I would assume so, but I'm not positive. I did do some research when I received this question, and I didn't feel overly confident giving an accurate answer. So my recommendation here would be contact your local municipal office or conservation authority to get clarification on removal and mitigation measures. And yeah, those are the preliminary questions, and I suppose I can pass it back to Monica so we can go into the chat box and have a discussion.
Perfect, thank you, Chris. I will just touch on one thing that's in the chat. Michelle pointed out that our native plant database is not rendering results when you click on your zone, and a couple other of you have also said that. So we're going to figure out what's going on with that, and we will, we can give you specific suggestions if you'd like before we are able to fix that issue. If you email me, I pop my email in the chat, I can help you and go in the back end and give you different native plants that will be suitable for your area. But we will also email everyone next week when we send the recording of this webinar and some of the links to the studies that Chris has mentioned through the presentation. We will also give you an update on what's going on with our database because I don't know what's going on with it right now, but we will figure that out. And I did also pop in the chat the members of the steering committee. So if anyone is wondering who was part of this amazing project and helping guide it, their names and organizations are also in the chat. So we will start going through the different questions in the chat. And if you haven't already submitted your question or comment, please feel free to do so in the chat. If we cannot get to all of them today, then we'll pass them on to Chris and he will be able to email you directly after this webinar. So I believe our first question is from Susan. She said that the study and survey showed little representation from Northern Ontario. Why do you think that is? And she is a disappointed Northerner asking that question.
Yeah, so our methodology with spreading the survey was mostly through social media and also through, I collected a random sample of emails from each of our stakeholder groups, and we disseminated it through email and contacts of that nature. And yeah, I did try to target a lot of our northern communities and regions, and I'm not sure. I was happy to see at least some northern representation, and I got more than I expected, to be honest. And we would certainly love to have more northern representation because Ontario is obviously a massive province, and we're only really licking the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, with looking at southern Ontario. So, and many of the important shorelands, most important shorelands for climate regulation and endangered species come from our northern regions. So we would definitely like to see more collaboration on that front.
Yeah, I will add to that many of our existing programs, we just naturally have established partnerships in kind of Eastern and Central Ontario. So if anyone knows of any northern groups that we could reach out to, that would be an amazing help for us. We do have some contacts in the Sudbury area through our Love Your Lake program, but if you know other people or organizations that would be interested in these results and giving us feedback, please feel free to email either Chris or myself, and we would be happy to schedule meetings with them. Next question is from Ron, asking, we have been a lake partner and we have a lake steward for many years. How would you suggest tips? I'm not sure how this question goes. How would you suggest tips on how a shoreland steward would align? Maybe Ron, can you reword that? I'm not sure what you're asking. And in the meantime, we'll go to the next question from Kathy. More work needs to be done with boat manufacturers who have currently been making boats that produce huge wakes. Have we had any discussions with boat manufacturers?
Not that I'm aware of, at least for this project, but like I've been reiterating, we're extremely open to having discussions with all stakeholders who are involved. I do know that wakes are a major issue, especially for nesting waterbirds. As a biologist myself, I'm aware of that issue at least. But yeah, we want to expand our network, and you know that's all about expanding the Shoreland network. Even through these webinars and the Planning for Our Shorelands project is to really involve all of the stakeholders which are impacting this issue and which rely on shorelands for whether it's economic well-being or environmental well-being. So I think that's an excellent observation to get boat manufacturers involved to discuss some of the complaints or concerns that some of our local constituents have in terms of the wakes being produced by some of these boats. And anecdotally, there is concern also for me on a personal note that we have the poker run at the St. Lawrence River, which obviously brings a lot of economic benefits to Gananoque, the town where I'm from, but there obviously is an ecological concern. And to me, collaboration is going to be extremely important on finding a balance between the needs of both these stakeholder groups, those who get enjoyment out of the lake or river in a certain way, but which might impact species in ways they're not aware of.
Our next question is from Ruth. So she's letting us know that the Ministry of Municipal Affairs generally holds an annual 1 or 2 day educational session for municipal politicians and planners. So she's wondering if we have ever considered working with their regional offices to give presentations, or if we will be able to once COVID restrictions have been lifted.
Again, this is awesome. Not so much questions, but just exciting new developments in what planning for our shorelands could be. Just to reiterate that we're sort of still in our nascent stage in terms of planning for our shorelands, and getting these surveys are really one of the huge steps in consulting with our constituents and stakeholders. But yeah, if any collaboration is any good collaboration, so you can send those resources to Monica or I, and we can definitely look into doing it in the future when the pandemic is under control, knock on wood.
Absolutely. David, I will send you different resources for plants in your region just because the database is not working. If you could send me an email or just where in Parry Sound area, we can definitely find that in our database. So I will get in contact with you. Rebecca is just mentioning that the Georgian Bay Biosphere also has many resources if you are looking for native plants in that specific area. So thank you for sharing, Rebecca. And Bancroft Area Stewardship Council also offers native plant seasons for sale each spring, which unbelievably is now. You know, we're starting to get ready for our Natural Edge program delivery as well. So now is the time if you're looking for native plants, especially with, I think everyone's still probably going to be a bit cooped up this summer. We're all going to be back out gardening as much as we can to enjoy the beautiful weather. So some great suggestions. Oh, Leora. Okay, so Leora has tested the database, so it doesn't work for a specific zone, but if you're just looking to pick based on the characteristics like plant height, your soil type, and your moisture content, then it still works. So it half works, I guess. We'll work on fixing that next week, though. So thank you, Leora. Okay, so Ron's gotten back to us. He's just wondering how we could, how a lake steward could incorporate the shoreland steward.
I suppose, well, sorry, read the question again.
Suggestions on how to incorporate the shoreland steward with the lake steward.
Okay. So I suppose, again, connections like this are important in making connections between different people. I think, you know, if we bring these issues or bring up issues of a lack of communication between certain stakeholders, I think it's important that those are brought up. And again, if anything, COVID-19 has made us all accustomed to using Zoom and digital platforms to get involved. So since Ontario is such a large province and we've brought up that, you know, we want to see more representation from northern communities, I think that this platform, Zoom, and also the digital platform gives us an excellent opportunity to discuss these issues and to make connections which otherwise would not be available. So yeah, I suppose collaboration again is the foundation of all.
And a couple of people are asking kind of metrics, how you measure success on a property. So I'm just going to throw in the chat the link to our resources page. And you'll notice the top one is the Lake Protection Workbook. So we found that this has been really helpful for individual property owners who are maybe just trying to do an initial assessment of their property. It goes through many different characteristics that Chris has talked on, like your habitat availability, light and noise pollution, all sorts of things, and they do their own self-assessment, and it kind of helps them see which areas they might want to work on or which areas they might be doing really well in already. And that is a free PDF download, so you can distribute it through your waterfront community or your environmental group, and that might be a really good first step. It is also available for purchase if you want hard copies, and you can send me an email if you would like to do that. In terms of kind of assessment, we do assessments with our projects, so we do follow-up evaluation surveys and behavior change analysis. So we will be sharing some of those resources as well this summer for the Love Your Lake program and Natural Edge program. So we can also distribute that to people who registered for this webinar if you'd like to have kind of some survey results to back up different changes you're maybe trying to implement. So we have a question from Susan. She's asking how lake stewards can encourage change-free lawns, pesticides use, and fertilizer use without seeming like a finger-wagging complainer.
It's also an excellent question. Again, yeah, it's frustrating that it's almost institutionally ingrained even in me. I will admit I do enjoy cutting grass and, you know, oh, the look of a nice cut lawn. And I think it's almost like the human condition to like neat and tidiness. But as an ecologist and with my partner being a landscape ecologist I've had, and working with watersheds and all the amazing lake stewards I've worked with, you're able to kind of view the beauty in messiness, so to speak. So I think wording things in so much, like you said, Susan was asking the question, that there is the issue of coming off as the finger wagging and being more of a pest than someone who's just trying to come and make a difference. And I think the way we approach certain stakeholders who might not hold the same values and attitudes, which is fine. I think coming at them with the, understanding that it's fine to think that this looks pretty, because ultimately maybe it does look a little aesthetically pleasing to have nice symmetric lawns and nice symmetric hardscape features. But to the wildlife around, which I'm confident everyone enjoys seeing when they live on the lake or river, one of the major components is to see the loons, to see the mergansers, to see all these different species of wildlife, is that it's their home as much as ours. And their home doesn't necessitate, this perfect landscape that's squared away or circled away. It requires messiness. It requires leaf litter. There are things like at the level of invertebrates that are so incredibly important, which we easily overlook when we're raking the lawn each spring. So that's all to say that I think the manner in which we approach these issues and come at it with a lot of excitement too, these sort of things, like the fact that we have to solve these issues, even if they are issues, the fact that we have a lot to work to do is exciting in a way, to me at least, as an ecologist, to be able to go out and teach people about things which get me giddy every day, salamanders and frogs and everything and birds. So, I think coming at it with an excited attitude rather than an attitude of slapping one on the wrist is really important.
And I'm going to kind of build on what Chris is saying, and it's really about trying to find ways, like Chris is saying, that they're passionate. So one of the things that we really focus on with our Natural Edge program is working with the landowner to pick species of plants that they want. So if there is a height preference, if there's a specific location, maybe they want to leave it open so that they can get to their dock. If we want to have lots of pollinator attracting species, we really want it to be their project, right? This is their property. We want them to steward it for years to come. So if you can talk about that balance where they can still have the things that are important to them, they can also maybe have, a side area that's not part of their view that they can give back to nature, and they're attracting different species that they want, then we find that can be much more effective because they were involved with it and they want it to continue for years to come. The other way you can go about it is to try and address issues that they are worried about or dislike. So one of the big ones that comes up with the lawns is that you get geese coming up onto your property. So you can talk to people about different pathway patterns. Maybe it's in an S pattern instead of straight down to the water. Maybe they're finding they're losing a lot of their property to erosion each year. We can talk about the importance of certain plant root structures. So it is a bit more intensive maybe to establish that relationship and figure out where they're coming from, but we find that's always what makes our projects the most successful.
Yeah, and that balance really is critical, like Monica had said. And one component of all this that has stuck with me that our executive director, Barb King, actually brought up was net environmental gain. So like Monica said, you can have an area set aside that is, neat and tidy, so to speak, and aesthetically pleasing to the human eye or the individual eye, but we can also offset that with planting native vegetation in other areas and making sure that there's that balance between the needs of society and the needs of biology.
So it's 11 o'clock. We do have, Chris and I have agreed to stay on a bit longer. So if you have your questions and we haven't gotten to them, feel free to still send them in. So we will be here for maybe about another 15-20 minutes. But you are also welcome to head out if you do only have the hour. We would just ask that if you do have to head out, we have a very short evaluation survey. So if you could answer that, I've just put it in the chat before you head out. That would be really helpful for us, just as we continue this freshwater community stewardship community. webinar series, we're trying to find topics that are relevant to you and that are helpful. So if you could just fill that in, that would be greatly appreciated. And also, before anyone has to head out, I will just let you know about the next presentation, which is taking place in a week and a half, so March 24th. And it is Melissa Dakers, Watersheds Canada's Lake Stewardship Coordinator. She is going to be talking about enhancing and restoring critical fish habitat in Ontario. So she is going to be talking about 2 projects. One, a fish habitat enhancement toolkit that will be launched later this month. And it will have different protocols and videos for community groups to be able to introduce and, enhance and protect local fish habitat. And then she'll also be talking about a pug-nosed shiner education project in the Quinte watershed. So if you would like to register for that free webinar, it is on Wednesday, March 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern. We realize that's during the workday. So again, of course, that will be recorded. So we encourage you to register so that we send you all of the resources and the recording afterwards. Ron's asking us to provide a copy of the Q&A. We can definitely do that, and we can maybe put like a 2-sentence bullet with Chris's or myself's answer. And we will get back to questions. So if you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I believe our next one is from Donna. She is saying, as property owners, is there anything we can do to limit or stop fishing tournaments on our lake? I see nothing but negative impact with increased fast boat usage and damage to fish habitats.
That's a good question. As an angler myself, and I don't prescribe too much to the whole like bass tournament stuff myself either. I'm more like going out with my dad in the boat once in a while sort of fisherman, and going out for a relaxing time on the dock when you need to alleviate some stress. So yeah, it can be frustrating to see. I know in Gananoque, actually, I'm going a lot of anecdotes, but there was a bass tournament here, and obviously most who are aware of the issue with around smallmouth, largemouth bass, and any other recreational fish is that there are limits to being able to catch if you are keeping them, and obviously live release. There's tons of stipulations as to the most effective way to release largemouth and smallmouth bass in a way that reduces stress to the animal, and which also gives them the best chance to recover after the angling event. Again, running tangents on this, is just an interesting topic. One of my colleagues from the University of Carleton, Stephen Cook, does a lot of research on live release of bass and other native fish. So, and yeah, it's again, maybe it's that question of education. I don't see being able to stop tournaments, but if you are witnessing practices during these bass tourneys, which are, not to the best. And the anecdote I was going to bring up from Gananoque is that a bass tournament had occurred, and they had kept the bass because they bring them in to weigh them, is what I'm from my understanding, to see who had the largest fish, and you keep them in a live well. And to me, that's a bit concerning, because the more you keep the fish out of its native habitat, the more stress it's going to be under. Anyways, in Gananoque, they ended up just throwing all the fish into a dumpster, like beautiful fish that could have been eaten or released back into the environment. And it was terribly sad, and it did leave a sour taste with the whole bass tournament that occurs annually in this town. But I think instead of coming at it with, we need to stop this from happening, I think maybe we need to shift the way in which they occur, rather than saying it just needs to stop cold turkey. And that involves maybe weighing the fish as quickly as possible on the boat and taking recordings there, instead of having a collection of people at the end of the tournament and keeping the fish in that alive well that long. And a lot of the time, a lot of anglers aren't aware of the proper way to release a fish once you've caught it. Using barbless hooks is a very effective way of reducing stress when you're releasing the fish, and also keeping them in the water when you're releasing them. So oftentimes we pick bass up by the mouth for that beautiful photograph, but it's not beautiful because that's putting undue stress on the animals. So keeping them wet in the water and releasing them, I think if we start implementing these practices into bass tournaments, I think we'll go a long way in pleasing both parties, and that people can continue to fish, but in a way that's more ecologically sustainable.
Graham is just pointing out kind of the same thing that we're trying to say, that when you're trying to, talk to people about different changes they might be able to make, you want to come at it from a side of education and not trying to legislate or shame them into, doing what you want them to do. And as Chris touched at the beginning of the presentation, not everyone is doing this out of ill intent. A lot of people, especially as they're just moving up for the first time, maybe to a cottage, they just don't know. And it's been so ingrained in them that a cottage should look one way. You have this lawn all around it. You have the beach, maybe that's artificial. And so we're just trying to come at it from an education side and just help them make choices that are great for the water quality, but also for what they see kind of in their head for their cottage. Angela is asking if you have any ideas or solutions for lakes that have been infected with Eurasian milfoil.
Ooh, cool topic. Well, not, as an ecologist, I'm biased towards I always took invasive species really seriously. And it wasn't until I took a course with Dave Beresford, who is an excellent professor from Trent, that I really started to get a greater understanding of this issue of invasive species. And unfortunately, the thing with invasive species, especially plants like Eurasian milfoil, which is what I think is what she was referring to. Yeah, Eurasian milfoil. Is that once establishment occurs, it's extremely difficult to get rid of a plant, especially, and an animal. Like, that goes across the board with invasive species, EAB, emerald ash borer, other aquatic invasives like round goby, zebra mussels, obviously with the St. Lawrence River just down the block. I understand how pervasive invasive species can be. So the biggest thing with invasive species, at least to me, is prevention. If you've got a lake or river that doesn't have Eurasian milfoil yet, then the best approach is to make sure that it doesn't get there through and like Monica and I have spoken about, educative campaigns to talk about the negative impact that milfoil and things like Phragmites can have on an ecosystem. And, to an extent, try to make it not fun, but to make science interesting again. Not all the doom and gloom that's always associated with invasive species, but make it so that prevention is something that we can all take part in. And if establishment of an invasive species does occur, there are certain ways that we can mitigate their impact through removal campaigns, which, while difficult and time-consuming, can occur, and in very localized instances can be successful.
I will just add to that we are planning some kind of invasive species case studies, if you will, for our summer webinar series through this community. I'm not sure off the top of my head if Eurasian milfoil is one of them, but we will be spotlighting different lake associations, river groups, that sort of thing, who have led campaigns to remove or increase awareness about invasive species and kind of their successes and failures. So I don't have those dates or topics yet, but if you are on our mailing list, which you are because you've registered, just know that that is coming. It has been brought up at many of our past Lake Links conferences, and it's a problem that so many different freshwater communities are facing right now. So we are trying to connect people with resources to either, like Chris said, prevent them from arriving, or if they are there, what people can do about it. So you can also stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and I just noticed Angela had followed up with saying that the milfoil invasion had already occurred and they were established in how to mitigate. I'm not an expert on the milfoil topic, and I know Watersheds, like Monica said, we want to do more invasive species work, but I know for other plant species, not aquatic species like dog strangling vine, there are oftentimes localized removal campaigns and planting regimes which can ultimately outcompete some of these invasive species, but they're invasive in the first place because they're extremely prolific and their ability to invade. So it is a difficult issue, and it's there's lots of solutions, but sometimes in a localized sense.
Donna is just asking, for those of you who are still on the call, if there are any lake associations present that have a designated shoreland steward. So maybe we can try and connect people who are already leading that work and people who are trying to maybe start doing more shoreland stewardship. So you can feel free to pop that in the chat or message us and we will connect you all. Vic is asking if it's truth or fiction. Arguments have been made that the buffer zone becomes a breeding ground for ticks and poison ivy. I can touch on that first if you'd like, Chris.
Yeah, sure.
We do have that problem, especially with ticks right now. People are trying to leave their buffer or even just wooded areas around their property, and they're finding that there are ticks everywhere. So one of the things that we try to suggest to people is to leave a designated area that's not near your home dwelling or your access point to the water as your natural area, and making sure that you have a really clear path. So you're clearing the brush from coming on the path, but you also have a very clearly marked path and you stay on that path. So that way you're not at risk of rubbing up against any of those plants, and you can still have that natural buffer, but again, not where maybe your access point would be. I don't know if you have anything to add, Chris.
Yeah, I'll chime in as the biased biologist again. And of course, we want to mitigate the risk of ticks. I've had 3 in my life, and it's never pleasant to be putting your pajamas on and to see a parasite on your leg. So yeah, and of course the Lyme disease stuff, which is awful. My best friend's father had Lyme disease. My neighbor has Lyme disease. A lot of people have Lyme disease, especially in the St. Lawrence Basin. Ticks are a major issue on the islands, and with this, it's one of those things where it's one of those biological things that we might just have to live with. Unfortunately, it's just a risk of going out in the bush and enjoying the outdoors, is that ticks do seem to gravitate towards those well-vegetated areas. But in my personal opinion, and it might not be reflected by others, is that providing a well-vegetated 30-meter or greater buffer, which will attenuate contaminants and nutrients that might otherwise leak into the watershed or water body, far outweighs the risk of getting a tick on you, especially if you're tick aware. There are countless educational programs about what to do if you find a tick crawling on you or that's already embedded in your skin, how to remove it, how to look for symptoms and signs. And that's not to downplay the severity of Lyme disease. I've seen it firsthand what it can do to people. But just being aware and knowing that when you go into the bush, tucking in your socks and your pants, those sort of rudimentary things that you need to do, it will be important to make sure that our shorelands aren't cut down just because ticks will be there. Because with changing climate too, it's almost inevitable that ticks will expand into these areas.
Sorry, trying to type and talk at the same time doesn't always work. A copy of today's presentation will be available, so we will email that to everyone. There will be the recording, which will go on our YouTube channel, and then we will also link to as many of those different reports that Chris had talked about during the presentation. We'll share those too. We will share things about the natural edge and different resources like the Lake Protection Workbook. So we will have everything in there that we talked about today, and that way you can easily share it with your lake association, municipality, maybe your neighbor. This can be a great opportunity to spark a conversation. So yes, they will all be shared. Some people are telling Chris that he did a great job, which I agree. So I'll pass that on and say thank you to Chris. I'm sorry if I'm not reading these all in order, but they're all coming in very quickly. So feel free to email us again if we didn't get to one of them. Susan is just mentioning that another issue with fishing is people emptying their bait buckets, which again goes back to education, but also I believe it's, oh, I don't want to get it wrong. The blue, I will find it, but they are also working not on just education, but also disposal sites. So it's really great if people know not to do it, but if they don't have an easy way of doing that action, then they're not going to do it. So they have been trying to reduce that barrier, especially for youth, trying to get them to establish those good practices early on. And I just forget who, Bluefish Canada, I believe. They have been focusing on proper disposal of bait and also fishing lures. So we can maybe link to their work as well in that email that we send out. Chris, do you know if there is an association of ecological landscape designers? And if so, how would someone find one that is in their area?
That'd be a good question for my wife, who's actually at work right now. She's usually right beside me, so I could have asked her. But again, in the digital age, sometimes it's easy as taking advantage of Google's algorithm and just putting in ecological landscape design and seeing what comes up. I know in the Ottawa area, I'm not sure, I shouldn't name names because that wouldn't be appropriate of me to do, but in terms of ecological landscaping networks, I don't know. I can dig a little deeper to that and ask Olivia tonight. And if, again, want to reiterate to everyone who's still here that I'm always happy to respond to emails. I love doing research and I love talking about this subject. So bring it on. We can discuss it at a later date, and I would be very willing to help out in that regard.
Same goes for me. If you have any questions, maybe more about our other programs like Natural Edge, Love Your Lake, the Fish Projects, I am happy to answer those as well. In addition to the education outreach programming that we're launching this summer for youth. So Chris and I are always happy to answer questions or connect with new partners. I believe we've gotten through all of them. Mary's just joined in, and we will definitely send you the link to the webinar and everything, Mary, so don't worry. We know that things come up and also internet doesn't always agree with us, so we will get all of these resources to you and everyone else. And I believe we have answered all of the questions. So just again, I will pop in the chat. If you have not had a chance yet, please answer the short evaluation survey. It would just really help Chris and I know how we did, if the information we covered was useful to you and your group. And also I will pop in the chat again the next webinar in our freshwater stewardship community, which is on Wednesday, March 24th at 2 p.m. And that will be focusing really on all of our fish habitat restoration projects and all of the amazing community partners we have worked with to launch our toolkit, and also our project in the Quinte watershed to help the pugnose shiner.
That'll be a good one.
We will send the evaluation link in that email that we sent to everyone. If it's not working, some people are saying it's not working for them. I just clicked on it and it works, but we will send that in the email to everyone as well. So if you can't open it right now, don't worry, we will still get it to you. And I think that's everything. So thank you everyone so much for joining, for sticking with us this sunny Saturday morning. And we will look forward to hearing from you and talking to you as we keep doing this important work and trying to help protect our shorelands.
Thank you, everyone.